The east wing of Rothmere Hall had been closed for 2 years, and no servant crossed its threshold without leave. And so when Eleanor tied the cook's apron over her gray stuff gown and lifted the covered tray as though she had every right to carry it, the 2 footmen at the corridor's mouth did not look at her face. They looked at the apron. They looked at the tray. They stepped aside. A woman in an apron, carrying food through a great house, is the most invisible thing in England, and Eleanor had learned that in 6 weeks of scrubbing pots she had once been served upon. She had not come to steal. She had come because a child was crying behind a sealed door, and no one in the house would say his name aloud. The tray shook a little in her hands. She steadied it against her hip and walked on, past the shrouded portraits, past the long windows where the December light lay gray and thin on the floorboards, and she counted the doors as the under-housemaid had counted them for her in a whisper. 3 on the left, the 4th on the right, the one they were forbidden to open. Her heart beat high in her throat. She could feel it there, a small, frantic thing, and she thought that if anyone stopped her now, they would surely hear it before they heard her voice. No one stopped her. That was the terrible ease of it. To the household below stairs. She was already a settled thing. The new kitchen woman, the gentlewoman who had come down in the world so far that she now peeled turnips for her bread, and who did not speak of what she had been, and who was therefore, in the cook's phrase, no better than she ought to be, and no worse than she had to be. Eleanor Vane had been the daughter of a gentleman with 400 acres and a library and a name. That meant something at the assembly rooms in the next county. Then her father had died in the spring with debts she had not known of, and the acres had gone to a cousin, and the library had been sold in lots, and by autumn she had walked 11 miles to Rothmere Hall to ask the housekeeper whether a woman who could read Latin might also be trusted to boil a fowl. She could. She had learned her hands, which had once turned the pages of Virgil, were now raw, at the knuckles from the lye and the cold water. And she did not look at them if she could help it. And yet the crying. The crying had begun 3 nights ago. Thin and high through the wall, where the kitchen passage ran close beneath the sealed wing, and no one would answer her when she asked what child wept in a house that had no children in it. Now she stood before the 4th door on the right, and she set the tray down on the floor, with great care, and she listened. Silence. First. Then a small indrawn breath, the particular breath of a child who has cried, until crying is only habit. She knocked, not loudly, the way one knocks who does not wish to frighten. "I have brought you something warm," she said low, through the wood. "May I come in?" The bolt on the inside drew back. That was the first thing she had not expected, that the door was bolted from within, that whoever wept had chosen to be sealed. The door opened the width of a hand, and an eye looked out at her, a child's eye, gray and swollen, in a face too pale for the season, a boy of perhaps 6 years. He looked at the apron, he looked at the tray she took up from the floor. And then, because she wore the apron and carried the food, he did the thing every soul in that house had done to her that morning. He decided she was safe. "Are you the new one?" he said. The old one went away. "I am the new one," Eleanor said. "My name is Eleanor. What is yours?" He did not answer that. He opened the door instead, and she saw the room behind him, and she understood in a single breath why the wing was sealed and why no one spoke of it. And she understood, too, that she had walked into something far larger than a crying child, something she could not now walk back out of. The room was a nursery, and it had been kept, not abandoned, kept. Wah! There was a fire laid but unlit in the grate, and a rocking horse under a holland cover, and a small bed made up with fresh linen gone cold, and on the mantel a miniature in a gilt frame turned deliberately to face the wall. A woman's things lay about as though she had stepped out only for a moment, and might, at any instant, return. A shawl across a chair, a book, face down, a pair of gray kid gloves, and in the midst of it, the boy, alone in a house that fed him through a hatch, and would not say his name. "You should not be here," said a voice behind her, and it was not the boy's, and it was not a servant's. It was a man's voice, level and cold. and it came from the doorway she had left open, and Eleanor turned with the tray still in her hands, and found herself looking up into the face of the Earl of Rothmere. She had never seen him. In 6 weeks below stairs, she had never once seen the master of the house, who dined alone, and rode alone, and was spoken of by the servants the way one speaks of weather that has done damage. He was tall and broad through the shoulder, and dressed in dark blue, with a plain white cravat tied without vanity. And his hair was black and cut close, and there was a stillness in him that was not calm. His eyes were a gray so dark they were nearly the color of slate, and they moved from her face to the apron, to the tray, and back to her face. And something in them changed when they reached her face the second time, though she could not have said what. "Forgive me, my lord," she said. She dropped what curtsy the tray allowed. "I hurt the child. No one would come. No one comes," he said, "because I have forbidden it." He did not raise his voice, though, and he did not step toward her, and his glance went past her to the boy. And for the briefest moment, so brief she might have imagined it, his composure moved like the surface of deep water when something turns beneath it. Then it was still again. "You are the kitchen woman." "Yes, my lord." "You are not a kitchen woman?" It was not a question, and she did not know how to answer it. So she said nothing, and the silence held between them longer than was proper, and the boy watched them both with his gray, swollen eyes. And outside the long windows the December light went on lying thin and gray across the floor of the sealed wing where no one was permitted to be. You are meant to wonder, at this point, why a grieving man keeps his own son behind a bolted door and forbids the house to speak his name. So did Eleanor. Stay with her a little while, and you will learn it, as she did, in the only way such things are ever truly learned, slowly and at cost. He did not dismiss her that night. That was the second thing she had not expected. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the untouched tray, and he said, in the same level voice, "He has not eaten in 2 days. If you can make him eat, you may come again." And then he turned and was gone down the gray corridor, and Eleanor stood holding a bowl of broth going cold in a dead woman's nursery. And the boy tugged at her apron and asked, in the small, flat voice of a child who has learned not to hope, whether she would truly come again. She knelt down to his level, which no one at Rothmere had done for him in a long while, and she said that she would. She set the tray on the little table, and she talked to him about nothing. About the goose in the kitchen and the cat that lived in the scullery and had one white paw, and while she talked, she fed him small spoonfuls. And he ate. When she left him, he was asleep, and she drew the fresh linen up over his shoulders, and she looked once at the miniature turned to face the wall, and she did not turn it round, because it was not hers to turn. His name, the under-housemaid told her the next morning, was Thomas. He was the Earl's son and the only child, and he had not spoken above a dozen words since the Countess died, and the sealed wing had been her wing, and the nursery had been her joy, and his lordship could not enter it, and would not empty it. And so it stood between the dead and the living, like a held breath that no one dared release. "The old cook said his lordship blames himself," the housemaid whispered, glancing at the door, "for her death, though how a man blames himself for a fever, I could not tell you." Eleanor said nothing. She remembered, though the way his composure had moved like water over something turning, and she thought that whatever the house believed, the truth of it was locked in that wing, as surely as the boy had been. She went again the next night, and the night after. She wore the apron because the apron made her invisible, and she carried the tray because the tray made her welcome, and the footman at the corridor's mouth ceased even to step aside because a thing that passes every night is no longer a thing that is seen. And each night she fed Thomas, and talked to him of small ordinary things, and each night he spoke a little more. And once, on the 4th night, he laughed. A startled sound as though it had surprised him, and Eleanor had to turn her face away because it undid her. The Earl came, sometimes. Not every night he would appear in the doorway in his dark blue coat, and stand with a stillness that was not calm, and watch his son eat from a kitchen woman's hand, and say almost nothing. He came more often as the week went on, though, and Eleanor began to understand that he came not to supervise her, but because it was the only room in the house where his son was becoming a boy again, and he could not enter it. And so he stood at its edge and watched from the threshold like a man at the shore of a country he had been exiled from. "You read to him," he said one night. She had a book of fables open on her knee, one of the Countess's own from the shelf, and Thomas leaned against her arm half asleep. "He likes the one about the lion and the mouse," Eleanor said. "The small creature that saves the great one. He asks for it every night." Something crossed the Earl's face. "She used to read him that one," he said. And it was the first time he had spoken of the Countess at all, and having said it, he seemed to regret it, and he turned to go. "My lord," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself. He paused. "He is not made of glass. He will not break if he is loved." For a moment she thought she had gone too far, that the cold would come down like a shutter, that she would be dismissed and Thomas left again to the hatch and the silence. The Earl stood very still in the doorway with his back half to her. Then he said, so low she barely heard it, "It was not the boy I feared would break," and he was gone. She sat a long while after that with the sleeping child against her arm, and she turned the sentence over and she began to understand that the sealed wing was not a monument to grief alone. It was a confession no one had heard. What she did not yet know was that she had been observed by more eyes than the Earl's, and that in a great house nothing invisible stays invisible forever, and that a woman who goes each night into a wing no one may enter will sooner or later be asked to account for it. 1. The reckoning came from the Dowager. Lady Margaret Rothmere, the Earl's mother, kept her own apartments in the West Wing, and her own account of how the house should run. And she had ruled Rothmere in all but name, since her son had withdrawn into silence. She was a handsome woman still, straight-backed at 60, with white hair dressed high, and a fan she used the way a general uses a field glass, to survey and to signal. She had decided long ago what the house needed. The house needed the Earl to marry again, to put the dead Countess behind him, to fill the sealed wing with a living wife and more children, and let the old grief be swept out with the old furniture. And she had chosen the wife. Miss Cassandra Pell, the daughter of her oldest friend, a beauty of 22, with £10,000 and a way of entering a room that made the room arrange itself around her. Eleanor learned all this the morning the Dowager sent for her, which no dowager does for a kitchen woman, and which meant she was already known. Lady Margaret received her in the morning room, seated, with Miss Pell arranged prettily by the window in sprigged muslin, and she looked at Eleanor's raw hands and her plain grey gown and her neat plain hair for a long moment before she spoke. "So this is the creature who has been carrying trays into my son's private wing," she said to no one, to the heir, to Miss Pell, who gave a small practiced laugh. "A kitchen girl playing nursemaid. How very affecting! Tell me, girl, do you imagine you are the first to think that the way to a widowed Earl's regard is through his motherless child? You are not. You are merely the boldest, the others at least kept to the schoolroom. The words sat in the air. Kitchen girl. It was meant to reduce her to a shape the Dowager could dismiss, and it did its work, and Miss Pell's laugh sounded again, softer, and Eleanor felt the old heat rise in her face, the heat of a gentleman's daughter being spoken to as if she were furniture. She had learned in 6 weeks below stairs, though, that the heat was a luxury she could not afford, and she folded her raw hands and kept her eyes level. "The child was not eating, my lady," she said. "He eats now. I ask nothing beyond that." "You ask nothing." The Dowager's fan opened. "How restful for you. You see, the difficulty is that what you ask and what you contrive are two different accounts, and I keep the books of this house. You will not go into that wing again. Thomas has a nurse. Thomas had a nurse," Eleanor said before she could weigh it, "who fed him through a hatch, and let him weep behind a bolt. Forgive me, my lady. I will do as his lordship directs." It was the wrong thing to say, and the right thing. And she knew both at once. The Dowager's face did not change, but her fan stilled, which Eleanor would come to learn was the more dangerous sign "As his lordship directs," Lady Margaret repeated softly. "We shall see whom his lordship directs, and how long." And she inclined her head the precise fraction that ended in audience, and Miss Pell at the window smiled the smile of a woman who has been told she has already won. Eleanor went back down to the kitchen and plunged her raw hands into the cold water and scrubbed a pot that was already clean, and she told herself that she had known from the first hour that this was not a thing she could keep. She had been foolish to let herself want it. She had let a child laugh against her arm and a cold man speak one true sentence in a doorway, and she had begun, without permitting herself to name it, to feel that at Rothmere Hall she was for the first time, since her father's death, standing on ground that did not shift. That was the danger. The ground always shifted. She knew that. She had learned it 11 miles from here with a bundle in her hand. That night the Earl himself came down to the kitchen passage, which no Earl does, and he found her at the great scarred table shelling walnuts by a single candle, and the cook and the scullery maids scattered like birds. And he stood in the low doorway with his head bowed a little under the beam, and he said, "My mother has spoken to you." "Yes, my lord." "You will disregard what she said." Eleanor set down the nutcracker. "My lord, I cannot disregard the mistress of the house. If I am forbidden the wing, I am forbidden it, whatever my own wishes." "Why?" She heard her own voice shake on the last words and hated it. He was quiet a moment. The candle threw his shadow huge against the whitewashed wall. "You wish to go?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I wish Thomas to be well," she said. "That is a different thing, and a safer one to wish." And then he did a thing that undid her more than the child's laugh had. He crossed the kitchen, which she had not thought he would do, past the hanging copper and the cold hearth, and he stood across the scarred table from her in the candlelight, close enough that she could see the exhaustion under the composure, the 2 years of it. And he said, low and level, "Come tomorrow. Come every night. I will answer for my mother." And then, as though the words cost him and he paid them anyway, "He asks for you when you are not there. He has not asked for anyone in 2 years." Her heart was doing the small, frantic thing again, high in her throat. She was aware of exactly where he stood without looking, of the warmth of the candle and the cold of the stone, and the particular fact of his nearness that her body registered before her mind would permit it. She kept her eyes on the walnuts. "Then I will come," she said. "Eleanor?" He said it was the first time he had used her name. He had said it as though testing whether he was permitted to, and the sound of it in his low voice went through her like the first warmth after cold, painful, and welcome at once. And she looked up at last and found him looking at her, not as a master looks at a servant, not as a man looks at a problem to be managed, but as a man looks at the one lit window in a dark house. Then he seemed to hear himself, and the shutter came down, the composure closing over the moment, like ice reforming over a river. And he straightened under the beam and said, "Miss Vane," giving her back her proper name and her proper distance in the same breath, and he bade her good night and was gone. She sat a long time over the walnuts. She did not eat one. The wound came out 3 nights later, and it came out because of the miniature. Thomas had been well enough that evening to want the fire lit, and Eleanor had lit it, the first fire in that grate in 2 years, and the light of it had reached the mantel and fallen on the little gilt frame that stood always turned to face the wall. Thomas had looked at it a long while. Then he had asked, in his small returning voice, whether they might turn it round, because he could not remember his mother's face any more, and it frightened him that he could not. Eleanor had not known what to do. And into that not knowing the Earl had come. Silent in the doorway as he always came, and he had seen the lit fire and the boy's hand half raised toward the frame. And he had crossed the room in 3 strides and taken up the miniature, and Eleanor had braced for anger. There was no anger. He knelt down the Earl of Rothmere on the nursery floor beside his son, and he turned the little frame around so that the boy could see, and he held it, while Thomas looked, and Eleanor saw the painted face of a fair young woman with a gentle mouth, and she saw the Earl's hand shake, holding it. and she understood that he had turned it to the wall 2 years ago. Not because he could not bear to remember, but because he could not bear what remembering told him. "She died of a fever," he said. Not to Eleanor. Not quite to the boy. To the fire. That is what the house believes. What is true is that she took the fever in the village, where she had gone against my express command, to nurse the cottagers' children who were sick, because she said it was our duty and I said it was beneath us and forbade her, and she went anyway, in secret, because she was better than I was, and she caught it there. And she died of my forbidding as surely as of the fever." He set the miniature upright on the mantel facing outward now, and he did not turn it back. "I sealed the wing because I could not enter a room that told me the truth about myself every time I crossed it, and I let my son grieve alone behind that truth, which was a second cruelty on the first. I have been a coward twice over." The fire cracked. Thomas had fallen asleep against the Earl's arm, the way he fell asleep against Eleanor's, and the Earl looked down at his son with an expression Eleanor had not seen on him, the composure gone entirely, and she understood that she was being shown something no one else in the house had ever been shown, and that it had been given to her precisely because she wore the apron, because she was no one, because a man may confess to the invisible what he cannot confess to his equals. She should have said something wise. She said only, "You forbade her out of love. She went out of love. There is no cruelty in either." The cruelty was the fever which loves no one. He looked at her across the sleeping child. "You are generous." "I am accurate," she said, and something that was almost the shape of a smile touched the corner of his hard mouth, the first she had seen, and it was gone at once, but she had seen it, and she carried it down to the kitchen with her like a coal in a warming pan. If Eleanor's story moves, you stay to the end. There is a scene coming she did not know how to hope for, and I should not like you to miss it. The dowager did not sit idle. A woman who keeps the books of a house does not lose a wing to a kitchen girl without a reckoning of her own, and Lady Margaret's reckoning was at dinner. She announced it grandly. A proper dinner, the first at Rothmere Hall in 2 years, 30 guests from 3 counties to celebrate the Earl's return to the world, and, though she did not say so, to display Miss Pell in her £10,000 of muslin and diamonds at the Earl's own table where all the county might see the match as good as made. The house came alive with the preparation of it. Below stairs, there was no sleep. And Eleanor, in the kitchen, chopping and blanching and plating from before dawn, understood that the dinner was aimed at her as surely as if the dowager had loaded a fowling piece, because a great public occasion is a machine for making things official. And once the county had seen the Earl seated beside Miss Pell, the seeing would become a fact. And the fact would become an expectation, and the expectation would close over the small lit thing in the nursery, like ice over a river. She did not let herself grieve it. She had the goose to truss. On the afternoon of the dinner, though, Miss Pell came down to the kitchen. This was itself a strange thing, a young lady of quality descending to the servant's domain in her sprigged muslin, and she came with a footman behind her, and stood among the copper and the steam looking at Eleanor with frank curiosity, as one looks at an animal one has heard described. "So you are the famous kitchen girl," she said, not unkindly, which was worse than unkindness. "Lady Margaret speaks of you a great deal. I confess I expected someone more cunning. You are only tired." She tilted her head. "I shall be mistress here by the spring, you know." "It is quite settled. I only came to see whether I ought to pity you or dismiss you, and I find I can do both at once. You may keep to your kitchen. I have no quarrel with the furniture." And she smiled her practiced smile, and went back up, trailing her footman and her scent, and left the word hanging in the steam furniture. It was the dowager's word in a younger mouth, and it did its work again, and Eleanor gripped the edge of the scarred table until the raw skin of her knuckles whitened. Kitchen girl. She had been called it 3 times now in this house, by 3 people who between them held every card there was, and each time it had been meant to tell her the same thing, that she was not a person but a function, not Eleanor Vane, who read Latin and loved a grieving boy, but a pair of hands that happened to be warm. She let go of the table. She wiped her hands on the cook's apron. And she carried up the first course when the bell rang because that was her function and she had learned to perform it whatever it cost. The dining room at Rothmere Hall. Seated, 30, and it was full. The great table blazed with candles down its length, and the silver caught the light, and the muslins and the diamonds of the county ladies made a saturated brilliance the length of the board, and at the head of it sat the Earl in dark blue and white, and at his right hand, placed there by his mother, sat Miss Cassandra Pell in white and diamonds. Beautiful and certain, and the whole room was arranged around the fact of them the way the dowager had arranged it, so that a stranger walking in would have said the match was made before the soup was served. Eleanor came and went with the dishes, invisible in her apron, one of the pair of hands that made such a room possible and were never once looked at by anyone seated at it. She was invisible until the doors at the far end opened, without leave, and a small figure in a nightgown stood in them, barefoot, on the cold marble, and every candle in the room seemed to lean toward him. It was Thomas. He had woken and found her gone, and come to find her, down the great staircase in the dark, past the servants who did not think to stop the master's son, and he stood now in the doorway of a room full of strangers, with his gray eyes enormous, and he did the thing a frightened child does. He looked for the one safe face. He found it at the servants' end of the room, in a cook's apron, holding a dish. And he said, into the sudden silence of 30 people, in a voice thin and clear as a struck glass, "Eleanor." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. The dowager rose at once, her fan snapping open, her voice smooth as poured cream. "The child is walking in his sleep. How distressing. Someone fetched the nurse." She turned to the table with a small, rueful smile, gathering the room back to her, smoothing the strangeness over. "You must forgive us. Grief makes a household eccentric. The kitchen has been permitted to grow above itself, but that is easily set to rights, and Mother." The Earl's voice was not loud. It stopped hers as a hand stops a clock. He had risen too. He was looking not at the dowager, not at Miss Pell white and rigid at his right hand, not at the 30 faces of the county turned toward him. He was looking down the length of his own blazing table at the woman in the cook's apron, who had gone very still with the dish in her raw hands, and at the barefoot child in the doorway who had said her name. The room held its breath. Eleanor's heart was high in her throat, that small frantic thing, and she could feel every eye in the county upon her now. The invisible made suddenly, unbearably visible, and she thought, this is the moment I am dismissed before them all. This is the ice closing over the river, and she braced for it, as she had braced for the anger that never came. The Earl came down the length of the room. 30 people watched him do it, past the candles and the silver and the diamonds, past his mother with her stilled fan, past Miss Pell in her ruined certainty. And he did not stop until he stood before Eleanor at the servants' end of his own table, and he took the dish from her hands and set it down, and he looked at her and he said, so that the whole room heard it clear and level and impossible to unhear, "This is the woman I intend to marry." 7 words. He did not explain them. He did not soften them or justify them to the county or apologize for them to his mother. He let them stand in the silence the way she had taught him. A true thing may be let to stand. And he took Eleanor's raw hand in his, and he did not let it go. Somewhere down the table, a glass was set down too hard. The dowager's fan hung open and forgotten in her hand, and for the first time in Eleanor's knowledge of her, the smooth account failed her, and she said only, "Julian," and then nothing, because there was nothing in her books for this. Miss Pell had gone white, and then, to her small credit, still understanding faster than the dowager that a thing had happened here that no dinner could undo, that she had been placed at the right hand of a man whose heart was at the other end of the room and always had been. She was the first to recover herself. She rose, and she made the Earl a small, correct curtsy, and she said with a composure Eleanor could not help but admire, "Then I wish you both very happy, my lord." And she meant it about as much as such things are ever meant, which was to say not at all, and yet not falsely, and she sat down, and the machine of the dinner having been broken, could not be mended, and the county understood that it had witnessed something and would speak of nothing else for a 12-month. Eleanor stood in the middle of it with her hand in his and could not speak. Thomas crossed the marble to her on his cold bare feet and pressed himself against her apron, and she put her free hand on his hair, and the three of them stood together at the servants' end of the blazing table, while the county looked on. And it was the Earl who ended it, drawing her and the boy toward the doors, out into the cool dark of the corridor, where the three of them could breathe. He did not make a speech there either. He was not a man of speeches, and she loved him. She understood in that corridor that she loved him, precisely for the sentences he did not make. He only turned to her and said low, "I have been a coward twice. I did not intend to be a third time, and let you go for the sake of 30 people I do not like." And then, because he had learned something from her about the truth being let to stand, "I have wanted to say your name in that room for a fortnight, Eleanor." "You might have warned me," she said, and heard her own voice shaking on the edge of laughter and tears together, "before you did it in front of the entire county." "I did not warn myself," he said. And the almost smile came again at the corner of his hard mouth. And this time it did not vanish. The dowager did not forgive it that night, but she was not destroyed by it either, because he had not destroyed her, only displaced her, gently and completely, from the center of the house she had ruled. She left for her sisters in Bath within the fortnight, on terms that permitted her dignity, and if she never entirely reconciled herself to a countess, who had once trussed her geese, she came in time to a colder truce, with the fact of it helped to it, by the discovery that the county decided within a season that the whole affair was the most romantic thing to have happened in 3 ridings, and received the new countess everywhere with the particular warmth reserved for a story people are proud to have witnessed. Miss Pell married a baronet in Shropshire the following year, and was by all accounts tolerably content. And the sealed wing was sealed no longer. They opened it in the spring, the 3 of them together. They did not empty it. Eleanor would not have that. They let the light in, and they lit the fires. And the rocking horse came out from under its Holland cover, and the miniature stayed on the mantel, facing outward, where Thomas could see his mother's gentle face whenever he wished. And remember, and not be frightened any more. The Countess's shawl Eleanor folded and kept in a drawer, not hidden, only kept, the way one keeps what one honors. The wing that had stood between the dead and the living, like a held breath, was allowed at last to let the breath go. By Christmas of that year, there was a fire in every grate at Rothmere Hall, and snow lay on the long windows of the wing that was a nursery again, and Thomas had a new tutor, and an old fable he still asked for at bedtime, the one about the small creature that saves the great one. Eleanor read it to him on the last night of the year with her husband in the chair beside her, and when the boy was asleep she sat a while in the firelight, and she looked at her hands, which she had not been able to look at once, and she saw that the knuckles had healed, the skin gone smooth again over the winter. A gentlewoman's hands once more. Though she found she was not sorry for what they had been. On the peg by the nursery door, where it had hung since the spring, was the cook's apron. She had never given it back. She could not have said exactly why she kept it, except that it had made her invisible on the night she most needed to pass unseen, and that a thing which carries you through a sealed door into the whole of your life, afterward, is not a thing you return to a hook below stairs. Thomas asked her once why a countess kept a kitchen woman's apron on the nursery peg, and she told him it was because it had opened a door for her when nothing else would. And the boy, who was young, accepted this as he accepted most things, and did not ask again. The Earl asked, though. Later that Christmas night, when the fire had burned low and the snow had thickened silently on the glass, he stood with her at the window and nodded toward the apron on its peg, and asked, in the low voice she had first heard forbid her a corridor, why she had kept it. She thought about the answer for a while. Then she took the apron down from the peg and held it, the plain gray cotton of it, worn soft, and she said that she had spent her whole life being seen for what she wore, the gentleman's daughter in her good gowns, the ruined woman in her gray stuff, the kitchen hand in her apron, and that only one person in all of it had ever looked past what she wore to what she was, and had done it. Of all the strange places in the world, across a dead woman's nursery on the coldest night of December. He took the apron from her hands and hung it back on its peg. Himself. "Then it stays," he said. And it stayed. Long after Thomas was grown, long after the county had found other things to speak of, long after the gray stuff gown had gone the way of all gowns, the cook's apron hung on the nursery peg at Rothmere Hall, plain and worn and honored, in the wing that no longer held its breath, in the house where a woman who had walked in unseen was, for the rest of her life, seen. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's story moved you, leave a comment with a moment you will remember, and I will read every one.